Welcome, listeners, to A Writer's Life. I'm your host, Heike Bohm, the author of the novel Secrets in the Shadows. A Writer's Life is a place where I'll be in conversation with fellow writers. We'll discuss all things writing. They'll read from their latest works, and we'll explore what happens beyond the pen in A Writer's Life. It's gonna be a page turner. I just know it. Pull up a chair and join us. I'm recording on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation.
The RCAF actually occupied Telegraph Cove during the Second World War. They fired everybody. They then took over the mill so that they could...
Welcome, listeners, to A Writer's Life. I'm catching up today with a fellow writer. I can't wait for this conversation to begin. Jennifer Butler is the great-granddaughter of Mame and Duke Wastell, who bought and named Telegraph Cove in 1912. Her many careers have included sound engineer, school teacher, jive dancer, actor, toy store manager, management consultant, and caterer. Jennifer's first book, Boom and Bust, The Resilient Women of Historic Telegraph Cove, received an honorable mention in the 2019 Lieutenant Governor's Medal of Historical Writing for being one of the most significant contributions to the historical literature of British Columbia. Jennifer has been a professional writer for over 20 years, as an entrepreneur supporting the Canadian academic research community and blogging her travel adventures. Her work has also appeared in BC History magazine. An intrepid traveler, she is based in Vancouver, surrounded by an overgrown collection of books and plants, plotting her next escape. Jennifer, it is an honor and a delight to have you on A Writer's Life. Welcome.
Thank you, Heike. It's lovely to be here.
Where were you born? And what was it like around your dinner table when you were growing up?
Oh, well, I'm from Vancouver, and it was, mayhem was perhaps the best word to describe our dinner table. We were 4 children born within 6 years, and my 2 parents, and we talked, we laughed, we told jokes. We didn't listen to each other. We repeated ourselves. It was noisy. It was funny. We were allowed to just be ourselves at the table. My poor mother tried very hard to, in her quiet voiced way, teach us proper table manners. And we always did have sit-down dinners as well as lunches and breakfasts. My father was away a lot with his work. It's interesting. My siblings were all very, very different people. Very different attitudes to life and professions and personalities, but we all have the same sense of humor, and that was very lucky. But it was also, it contributed to the wildness of our dinner time conversations.
Growing up, what were some of your favorite books?
Oh, I loved books. I could read before I got to school, and I started reading real stories, of course, things like Beatrix Potter books and everything when I was very young. And then I soon latched on to writers such as Lucy Maud Montgomery, particularly the Anne of Green Gables books, also all the Little House on the Prairie books, Louisa May Alcott. I love the books of Lucy Maud Montgomery. I actually started reading Dickens when I was in grade 3, and I love Charlotte's Web, A Wrinkle in Time, Chrysalids, a lot of myths and legends and fairy tales. And I realized that I was gravitating to books where there were strong female leads, everything that I wasn't but desired to be.
Going back to Lucy L. Montgomery, years ago, me and my husband, we traveled across Canada and we went to PEI. And of course, I loved Anne of Green Gables. And I was really surprised that Anne of Green Gables wasn't filmed on PEI. It was filmed in Alberta, one. And I did buy Lucy L. Montgomery's book. And I carried that like it was the best treasure ever.
Funny, I did the same thing when our family drove across Canada, and I went to the house and I got the triple pack of the first three of the Anne of Green Gables books, and they are dog-eared and falling apart. I still have them, and I've got replacements. But yes, there's something about those books, maybe for a Canadian, because so many of our books came from England or the United States. So to have a Canadian heroine was really inspirational. She was an interesting woman, and I'm glad that her works are still being discovered by young girls and boys today.
Yeah. Had you always known you wanted to be a writer?
I think I came to writing from reading. So after reading these wonderful books and just feeling so inspired, that was an ambition. I wanted to be a writer. But I never felt I had anything really to say. I wrote short stories that got into the school paper, and I got something submitted to Owl magazine and that sort of thing. But to write a whole book, I felt I needed to be much more experienced in life, much more intelligent, have something to say. I wasn't like Proust, who could write an entire book about eating a Madeleine. But I really decided, okay, you know what? I'm going to get out there and live my life so that I will have something to say. And someday I'm going to write a book. And I was very ambitious. I wanted to travel to every country. I wanted to do every job there was possible. I wanted to read every book that had ever been published. And really that kind of ambition carried me through my whole life. Thankfully, I also took up ballet when I was 5. So at least I was doing something physical and artistic. Otherwise, I would just be reading books 24 hours a day. But so in my head, it was always, someday I'm going to write a book. I just need to figure out what it's going to be about.
You had said you got published in Owl magazine. Do you remember what that piece was?
Oh, gosh, no. I must have been about 11 or 12, and it was a huge deal. But I couldn't even remember. I had a copy in my box of treasures that I had growing up. But having moved, I lived abroad for many years and traveled around a bit, and somehow it got tossed or something. So I have no idea what it was about. I'd like to think that it was a little spark of genius, but I doubt that very much.
It probably was a spark of genius. For over 20 years, you've been an entrepreneur supporting the Canadian academic research community. Can you talk about what sort of research that job entailed?
Oh, well, it was any research, really. It still is. My husband and I are partners in our business, and the Butlers and Associates, a very imaginative name. But we work with universities, with hospitals, with colleges, with technical institutes, anywhere where research is conducted, particularly applied research. It's in any discipline. So we've done work with health, humanities, chemistry, astrophysics, anything. And it's really to help individual researchers, teams of researchers, or the institutions themselves develop research programs that are going to help solve one of the world's great challenges and provide benefits that are either social, environmental, health, or economic to the regional, national, or international audiences. All our projects have been Canadian-led, but many of them are international in scope and partnership. And we've raised more than $1.5 billion for Canadian research. Well, we haven't raised it, but we have assisted the researchers with successful research projects that have taken Canada to the forefront of innovation in all these different research fields. So it's fascinating. I get to learn about what's going to help change the world 5 or 10 or 20 years in advance, and help those that can actually do good work get the funding they need in order to make that happen. I always feel that we can't cure cancer ourselves, but if we can help those that actually can, that's a great legacy. And so what's really been inspiring is now that we've been doing this for 20 years, we will look in a magazine, The Economist, or a newspaper, and we'll read about some amazing discovery or development, and we know that that is one of our babies from 10 or 15 years ago, and it's a really lovely feeling. We feel like, okay, this is a good purpose for our professional lives.
Wow, it's almost like you get to have a crystal ball and look into the future of what's coming. So, can you give us a bit of information what's to happen in the next 5 years?
Well, confidentiality precludes me talking about any of the projects that are in the works now, but we have worked on projects that have measured the ionosphere and the magnetosphere, which has been very helpful in climate adaptation. We've worked on a project for CERN, which is the Hadron Collider in Switzerland, with the very first project dealing with antimatter, measuring the gravity of antimatter, and that's a Canadian-led project, which then looks at the fundamentals of life in the universe and the start of the universe. We also worked on the reimagining of the Museum of Anthropology out at UBC when they were going through a revamp and putting a lot of their artifacts and their stories, particularly the oral stories of the First Nations peoples of BC, into a digital format that could be accessed by scholars around the world. So it kind of reimagined about what a museum actually is. And it's not necessarily just a building for people to walk in and out of, but is a fund of information that could be accessed by anyone, anywhere. Lots of projects on health. The Michael Smith Cancer Building in Vancouver was one of our early projects that we helped work on. So it's really all over the map, and it's a very satisfying and exciting program, really.
That's fascinating. When you were talking about the Museum of Anthropology and recording the audio storytelling, could you expand on that a little bit?
Is digitizing them and making them accessible and cross-referencing them so that scholars from other countries and regions that were also studying other First Nations languages and songs and stories and so on could look at similarities and differences and so on. And it was really just putting the whole collection available beyond the physical dimensions of the museum itself.
Absolutely brilliant.
And it was really one of the first museums that was starting to look beyond the four walls. One of our recent projects with another researcher out of a university in Quebec is also looking at museum studies, but in terms of trauma, how nations deal with trauma, whether it's the Holocaust or whether it's First Nations issues or whether apartheid. And so this researcher is working with other museums, other researchers around the world and developing programs for museums on how to develop programs that deal with collective trauma and to learn from that for other scholars and other populations around the world. So it's really exciting to be part of something that then becomes a greater story in other locations that then becomes a global resurgence of research and scholarship that impacts on individual populations.
When I was recording my mom for some of my research that I did with my book, she talked about having to escape East Germany in 1961, literally a day before the wall started to be built. And so I had this lovely audio recording of her telling this story. And then I discovered through the research, the Marienfelde which was a refugee center. And I found images of it and I sent it to my mom. And by doing that research, they were asking people for accounts of escaping East Germany. And so I was able to actually give them the recording of my mom. And I thought it was so lovely that people would go into the Marienfelde Museum in Berlin and they could discover one of these stories. I just love that. That is just a wonderful way. Because when I go traveling, one of the things that I love that I absolutely have to, the first thing I do when I get to a place, I have to go to the museums and to listen to audio, people's stories. That just elevates everything. To hear all these different cultural stories is wonderful. It's beyond wonderful, really. It just triggers your imagination in so many ways. And in fact, that we can share them in a museum is incredible. Okay, you're the great granddaughter of Mame and Duke Wastell, who bought and named Telegraph Cove. Can you talk a bit about who they were and what made them settle on the eastern coast of North Vancouver Island?
Well, they actually came to the area in 1909. My great-grandfather, Duke Wastell, was hired to manage the sawmill for the BC Fishing and Packing Company in Alert Bay, which is across the strait from Telegraph Cove. And in 1910-11, he bought out a bad debt on 376 acres of land on Vancouver Island across the strait from Alert Bay. And in 1912, the superintendent of telegraphs was looking to find a location for the terminus station for the telegraph that was going up Vancouver Island. And Alert Bay was the obvious place because that's where the population was. But as it was an island, it would be too expensive to run cable under the water. So they were looking for a place on Vancouver Island that was protected by the winds and the elements, and it was easy to put up a little telegraph shack and run the line, and also easy for somebody to run the messages that were taken by Morse code into the telegraph station across to Alert Bay and post them on the bulletin board, which is kind of an early form of social media. They also didn't really care about privacy, of course. Everybody in the town would come down and look at the message that came in. But Duke took the superintendent of telegraphs to this little cove that he had been logging, and that was deemed perfect. And so Duke decided that Telegraph Cove was the proper name for it. And then in 1925, my great-grandfather and my grandfather, Fred Wastell, along with a Japanese businessman, decided to set up a fish saltery and a box mill in Telegraph Cove for the Japanese market. And mostly of the Japanese workers who were involved in the saltery and the box mill. But in 1928, the sawmill in Alert Bay shut down, and both Duke and Fred were out of a job. And in 1929, the stock market crashed. So it was Mame, actually, who told her son, my grandfather Fred, with his new wife and tiny baby, that they should move to Telegraph Cove and expand the sawmill there and turn it into a lumber operation beyond the box requirements for the saltery fish. So my poor grandmother has to leave her nice little home in Alert Bay and move into a 12 by 18 foot lineman shack with an outhouse. And that was really the start of it. It was a saltery operation for about 10 years, then a very 50 years. And then Telegraph Cove moved into a tourism phase. Oddly enough, it was the site of the very first whale watching operation in British Columbia, in tiny Telegraph Cove with my grandfather's old tugboat. And now it is known for tourism, for whale watching, yes, and also hiking and camping and fishing. And you can still stay in some of those old original sawmill houses, including my grandparents' house.
So is your grandparents' house still in your family?
It's known as the Wastell House. Yes. And it's the original line shack that then got added to, and then added two more, and then it was jacked up so another story could go underneath. So that house has had several incarnations, but one of the corners of that house is the original Telegraph line shack of 1912. And I don't know if anybody else really knows what corner it is, but every time I look at that house, I think, yep, I know that bedroom.
So do you go up there regularly?
I did. My mom and my aunt were born up there. They lived there through the Depression and the Second World War. The RCAF actually occupied Telegraph Cove during the Second World War. They fired everybody. They then took over the mill so that they could have a presence because they were worried about Japanese invasion. And they also built the airport in Port Hardy with Telegraph Cove lumber, and another airport in Cole Harbor up on the North Island as well. And they allowed my grandparents to stay in the cove because they owned the land, but they took over the boat and everything. And my grandfather didn't have a job for several years, but they kept the school open. My grandmother was instrumental in getting a one-room schoolhouse built and staffed with remarkable teachers from 1934. And that school went right up until the late 1950s. And so it was very much a family community. It was not like other lumber camps in the area. There was no alcohol or fighting or gambling. And that was due to the women. It was a family-oriented place with the school. Everybody watched over each other's children and helped out where they could. And it was a very unusual community for that area.
During World War II, Telegraph Cove would have had Japanese families living there, correct?
Actually, yes. This was it's a dark story of all of our country, really, but there were Japanese workers living in the cove right from the early 1920s. And in 1941, in December, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, the Canadian government bowed to existing racism and ordered all those of Japanese heritage to move away from the coast, to move inland or be moved. And most of the people in Telegraph Cove, well, they were all warned ahead of time, and most of them left of their own accord. But one family stayed. And in March of 1942, that family was removed and split apart. And the wife went to the P&E with her baby daughter and lived in the agricultural building for a bitterly cold winter. The husband went to work on road camps. They were then able to join together and move to a prairies with other family members and worked on farms. But at the end of the war, they were still not allowed to come back to the coast. That order was not rescinded until 1949. So they ended up moving to Toronto and living the rest of their life in Toronto.
So none of the Japanese residents of the time moved back to Telegraph Cove and reclaimed their homes?
No, the good thing is that at that point, all the original Japanese workers in the Cove had shares in the business. They were all given shares and they were able to cash out the shares. Now, the Japanese businessman who was a partner bought back a lot of those shares using his own money. And he himself was a Japanese businessman who had to move away from the coast. Property was taken from them. In this case, with the one family that was removed from the Cove, their stuff was kept in storage in the Cove, hoping that they would come back. But by the time it was 1949 and they could move back, everybody had gone on to other lives and had set up homes and businesses in other locations. So that then meant that when the RCAF came in, the workers, many of the houses were already vacant because the Japanese workers had already left, but all the other people who were working in the Cove were evicted as well, so that the RCAF could take over. And then after the war, the business had to be built up again. Mind you, this was happening all over Canada. And this was one of the things that really struck me about writing the book, is how this tiny village, which had an average population of 45, it peaked at 60, and yet it mirrored all the events that were happening in Canada. It was directly impacted by the Depression, the First World War, the Japanese internment, and then after the war, the baby boom, international immigration by Europeans who had grown up in the war and who had immigrated to Canada to have a better life as young adults that they would never be able to get in post-war Europe. There was also social change and the transition from a resource-based economy to tourism. So I realized that this book and the experiences of the women, no matter in which era and where they were from, were a little mirror held up to what was happening in all of Canada. And that was another really exciting discovery I made while I was writing the book, which wasn't really part of my original purpose. And yet it became such a great revelation.
What finally triggered you to write Boom and Bust?
I was actually in Telegraph Cove in September 2015 for an event representing the Wastell family. And I had people come up to me and say, "Oh, your grandfather, Fred, sounded like such a great character. Tell me about him." Or, "Oh, your great-grandfather, Duke, he was the founder of this place. Tell me about him." And I realized that no one was asking me what my grandmother was like, Emma, or my great-grandmother, Mame. And that's when I thought, I could write about them. And then I thought, I could write about all the women in the Cove, because there weren't that many. I think there may have been only maybe not even 500 people that ever lived in Telegraph Cove. And of that, maybe 100 were female. So I'd grown up there. I spent all my childhood, adolescent, university summers. They were my summer friends, the kids up there that were baby boomers like me. And I knew their mothers. And so I thought, yeah, you know what? This is a project that I could do. And I might actually be the only person who could write this book. As I had the direct connections, the materials, the knowledge, the background knowledge of the place, and that was what really excited me. And so that was the germ of the book. Well, there's really so little information about what it was like for women who lived in these resource-laden towns, villages, hamlets. And that's what intrigued me as well, is that there's not much information about female pioneers. There's very little by female pioneers.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think history is written by, but it's also then who will accept it for publication, who will put it in a library or in a museum. And for a long time, women's stories were not deemed particularly interesting. Many women didn't have time or interest in writing about what life was like. Society wasn't particularly interested in knowing what was going on inside a home. Rather than maybe what was going on in the business that drove the town. And I think these interior lives, particularly in places like Telegraph Cove, where the family unit was really what made Telegraph Cove unique, deserve to be told and need to come out into the world to kind of right the balance a little bit and give us a little bit of that other side. Libraries are full of books by men, about men, and wonderful, because a lot of times men were the only ones allowed to go out and do and have adventures and to take part in entrepreneurial activities or the new world. And women were, if they were there at all, they were marginalized or considered wives or helpmates. At their best, the people involved would acknowledge the contribution that the women made. But from a literary point of view and a historic point of view, there was really very little. And as I was doing the research, going to museums and archives and looking through newspapers and magazines, this became more and more obvious to me, that hearing about what it was like for women from different eras, from different backgrounds, who were all put into a small village that was isolated. You could only get there by boat. There was no road joining the north or south of Vancouver Island until almost 1980. So it was very remote, very isolated. These were women from all different cultures, all parts of the world. None of them were there by choice. They were all there because their husbands got a job in the mill. There were a few rare ones who were school teachers that couldn't get a better job somewhere else, and so ended up in Telegraph Cove. And so this was what really interested me in a grand way, but being able to have access to these stories in this small place was a real thrill for me.
Would you delight our listeners by reading an excerpt from Boom and Bust?
Yes, I'd be thrilled to. This is a excerpt from the chapter on Nancy Okura, who lived in Telegraph Cove from 1940 until 1942. There were barely 30 people living in Telegraph Cove during the 1930s, a mixture of Irish, Canadian, Japanese, Chinese, and English, all living together and working together and treating each other as any neighbors and colleagues would, regardless of background. If you were a good worker, a good housekeeper, a good child, that's how you were considered. However, the outside world's political rumblings were impossible to ignore. Charlie Nakamura advised the Japanese families living in Telegraph Cove it would be prudent to move away from the coastline, as he foresaw war with Japan, move to Vancouver, and consider their options to move to the interior of the province. Masaru and Hideko Okura decided to return to Japan and to Masaru's prosperous family's endeavors. He had lots of family land just north of Tokyo, good for growing rice. Although they survived the war in Japan, life was hard for them, particularly for their Canadian children. Kenji and Nancy Okura, however, opted to stay in Telegraph Cove. They had not been there long, there was good, steady work, and they now had the Okura house to themselves. They believed remaining in Telegraph Cove would be their safest option. Japan made a bombing raid on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in December 1941, and suddenly prospective tensions became a potential threat. All Canadian inhabitants of Japanese racial descent, some 23,000, were treated as enemy aliens, even if of Canadian birth or citizenry. Public and political pressure led to the formation of the BC Security Commission, which sent police and military personnel to round up and send all so-called enemy aliens to resettlement areas, a move that was promoted as protective. Dates were set and numbers tabulated. 14 people were scheduled to be deported from Telegraph Cove. This turned out to be just 3, Kenji, Nancy, and baby Marion, as the others had already left. Those who did not agree to go were to be considered possible dissidents, arrested, and jailed with no chance of even a hearing. On March 15, 1942, a naval officer came to the Ogawa's door in Telegraph Cove and gave the family 3 hours to pack up all they could carry and leave everything else. In shock, Nancy started to methodically wash the lunch dishes, upset at the thought of having to leave dirty dishes in the sink. Then realized her 3 hours could be better employed, whereupon she packed up the baby's things and put Marion in her new pram. At the dock, the officer told her she had to leave the pram behind. Her final memory of Telegraph Cove was looking back and seeing the empty pram sitting on the dock. The Okuras boarded a government boat and left their home, never to return. The rest of the community was speechless that such a thing had happened at all, let alone to one of their own. Fred Wastell cleared space in the old net loft to put everything the Okuras had left behind for safekeeping, all neatly labeled with their name to be claimed after the war. For years, those items sat there untouched, the Cove confident in the Okuras' return. And now I'd like to read a section from Lisa Ziggiotti, who was an Italian woman who grew up in northern Italy during the war and immigrated to Canada in the 1950s. She actually lived in Telegraph Cove from 1958 to 1987. The Ziggiottis didn't own their land, but they possessed it entirely. Sometimes you say the way nature is or the way fate is, you want this and you want that and you don't get it, but in the end you get what you really wanted from the beginning, declared Lisa. In Telegraph Cove, I had 5 children. Where could I have found a place better than Telegraph Cove to raise 5 children? As the family grew, they installed a large propane stove, which significantly added to the house's heating and baking capacity. Many years later, the Ziggiottis were the first family in Telegraph Cove to get a dishwasher, to Lisa's immense pride. In Italy, women were never brought up to have tea or coffee together and chat. Lisa's mother would go and see her friends maybe once a year. People were just too busy for such leisurely activity. The men had a social life on the job site, but women worked at home alone. In Telegraph Cove, there was no shopping, no hairdresser, nothing, not even church. Lisa never did get used to visiting anyone without good reason. Sometimes Eva Vinderskov was able to get Lisa to their house for a dinner party, where Lisa was the life of the party, but it was not easy to persuade her to go. The distinctions between landowners and bosses and workers were felt, particularly by those who had grown up in countries with enforced class systems. The women of Telegraph Cove were, however, always available to help each other with practical issues, such as child rearing. Everyone would look out for everyone else and share what they could. Eva had a crib with yellow ruffles on it that she lent to Lisa, who put white ruffles on it, and then it went back to Eva and back to Lisa, and so on for a total of 8 babies between them. Some mothers get by best with strict daily routines, but Lisa loved the freedom of making each day work the way it needed to. Then an hour before Frank came home, she made supper and everyone would be happy. Of course, there were daily chores, such as keeping the stove going so the house stayed warm and provided hot water. If she ever got stressed out, Lisa would just start sewing. She liked to sew and made everyone's clothes, including Frank's shirts. Back in Italy, when Lisa and her schoolmate went to Padua to get their emigration papers, they visited a famous lingerie shop, the same shop patronized by the actress Sophia Loren for brassieres. Lisa's friend had enough money to buy one, but Lisa did not. Lisa borrowed her friend's bra, took it apart, made a pattern, and then constructed her own garment before putting her friends back together. Lisa had that bra for 15 years.
What an amazing story you're telling. It's beautiful.
Actually, interestingly enough, there's a woman, Eva Vinderskov, who was referenced there. She was actually born in Berlin in 1933. So you can imagine her childhood living in Berlin during the Second World War was amazing. What she went through as a young girl, first having to live in Berlin and then fleeing during the bombing on the city, and then having to flee back again ahead of the Russian raids. No wonder these women came to Telegraph Cove in their early 20s with their handmade linen or woolen suits and felt that they were in a better place. It's hard to imagine that someone would have come to Telegraph Cove then and thought, this is a better life. But for them, it really was.
It really was, yeah. What did your writing journey look like for this book?
Well, as I say, I had direct material given to me. I had a box of documents and charts and maps and photos that were at my disposal that would have been impossible for anyone else to access. The research probably took a solid 2 years. I started with interviewing my mom and my aunt, And then I went through all their material. I also got the names and addresses of the mothers that I had grown up with that were in Mom's Christmas card list, and I contacted them. I would travel to them and I would then just record them on an app while we had a conversation. And then from them, I would get more contacts and more contacts. Mind you, this was not always easy. A lot of women had died. Their phone number was wrong. Their names were misspelled. I couldn't find them. They didn't have children. And some women were in the Cove for such a short period of time, nobody even remembered them. So I was finding obituaries sometimes as often as I was finding actual women. But I would interview them. I would then ask to look at their photos. Thankfully, I had a suitcase of old negatives from the 1920s and 30s and 40s. In the 1920s, photography was new technology, and my grandparents were in their 20s, so they had tons of pictures of boats and picnics and parties and dance nights and events around and the building of the town and the development of the town. Interestingly, there were no night shots, as there was no flash photography for many years after that. And that was one of the challenges, because women's lives were lived inside the home, working at home, doing everything from child rearing, homeschooling, washing, ironing, and this is with a washing machine that wasn't electric, ironing, drying, cooking, mending, making clothes, all unpaid, of course, and also having to be the de facto family doctor, although my grandmother, Emma, was a nurse, and so she was the medical professional for the entire village, again, unpaid in that capacity. But I was able to gather so much material from the women themselves, which I then transcribed and tried to cobble into a sort of chronological narrative. I was very lucky in that my grandfather had been interviewed a few times, and those tapes were in the BC archives. And to hear his voice decades after he'd passed away was just lovely. And the cassettes that my grandmother had recorded her memoirs on in the 1970s. And so I was able to hear her voice again after all these decades of time in between. And that was lovely. And it gave me a sense of responsibility to all the women to tell their stories using their words and to honor their truths, which I know are subjective. You know, memory is subjective, as is truth. And getting a fact from one person and a fact about the same event from another person, which isn't always the same, you have to kind of bridge it so that you're grounded in fact and reality, but at the same time, working through a subjective lens.
Growing up, did your mom talk to you a lot about her life living there? And obviously you would go there, so you would know what life in Telegraph Cove was, but would she talk about her childhood as you were growing up? Like my mom always told me her war stories of how she escaped the Red Army. And that became almost my world as well, because I grew up hearing her war stories.
Wow, that must have been amazing to hear such stories from your mom. My mom's growing up to her. I think so many children, you grow up and you just think this is your life. You don't think it's anything unusual unless you're living through an extraordinary situation, such as your mother. My mom, it was just living in this small place. And so, yes, she would sometimes talk about when we were kids, we did this. And when I went to school, we did this. It was often when we were in Telegraph Cove on our summer holidays that she would take us to places that she rode to as a 5-year-old in a big, heavy, clunky rowboat. Or she would talk about her favorite teacher and then recite one of these poems that she still remembered having memorized. But it was probably later when I was writing the book that I was really able to tap into her memories. And thankfully, her memory is amazing. And so she was able to take the little stories that I've been told, but you listen, but you don't really take it in. And then to actually ask specific questions and to really listen and to really put this event with this time in this place and to link it to people whose names you'd heard all your life but didn't really know how they fit, and to now actually make them fit was a really great thing. I kind of think of the book in a little way as a bit of a love letter to my mom, and also to my grandmother and great grandmother. It's kind of acknowledging the part that all these women play by being mothers, by being the first guides that we had growing up, and acknowledging the fact that they're people. They're not just moms or grandmothers, but they are people who have memories and experiences and impressions and have gone through some very challenging times, and that those things are worthy of acknowledging and learning from. Anybody who works with history, we all stand on the shoulders of the people that have gone before us. And especially when you're talking about the mothers. And actually, I interviewed the daughters for this book as well, because I thought they would give another viewpoint of what it was like to grow up female in a resource-heavy locale, but also the lessons they learned from their mother, either overtly or just by watching them and growing up with them. And that they could then look at their mothers as more than just this person who was there all their life, wiping their noses and making soup at lunchtime, but as a real person who was young and had ambitions and had good luck and bad luck and challenges, and were restricted because of either politics or their gender or their finances, and they had less opportunities because of any of those, and to acknowledge what they've done.
While you were writing your book, was there any one particular thing that really struck you, as in, you found a common thread throughout your story?
I was really struck by the universality of these women's experiences, that it didn't matter where they were born, where they came from, how old they were, what era in which they lived, that there were intersections of shared and common experiences that really gave an overarching arc to the women's experience throughout the 20th century in this small place in Canada. And as I say, that it was a mirror to what was happening in all of Canada. And I realized that each story is like a thread in a tapestry. And I was weaving the tapestry, pulling in all these threads. And some of the threads were very short because maybe I only knew the name of the woman. I didn't know anything about where she was from or even how long she lived in the Cove. And some of the threads, some of these women lived in the Cove for 45, 50 years. And so I felt that the picture was the sum of the individual parts, and that I did not want to negate the experience or marginalize the experience of any woman who'd lived in the Cove, even if she'd only been there for a few months. These women were very candid with me. They were honest. It takes a lot of courage sometimes to tell your story. And for women, it's harder. I think women have always been the keepers of the family secrets, the family's honor. Some of them went through very difficult situations, but they were very careful about how their fathers would look like, or how their brothers, or, they didn't look at things the same way that I think a man in the same situation would. We're still protective, but also women can be harsh judges, and they can be very harsh judges of other women. And so there was that acknowledgement that this book needed to be authentic and honest, but also sensitive to what it was like for people to grow so closely together in a tiny community. And yet their little thread, however short or long it was part of this wonderful tapestry.
Nice. While you're talking, what really struck me was right in the beginning, I asked you what books inspired you, what books you grew up reading. And when I think about Little House on the Prairies, Anne of Green Gables, they were all about women, young girls. And then you're writing about Telegraph Cove. I mean, talk about how can you not have been influenced having, these pioneer women living in small communities. And then here you are writing about Telegraph Cove.
Yeah, it's like coming full circle. All those years of wanting to be able to write a story and looking for a story that I could write. And there it was already there for me. And it was waiting for me to get to the point where I was ready to acknowledge that this was a story I could tell. And it's probably no surprise that those books that I loved as a child were fictional representations of what real women were dealing with, and being able to celebrate the lives of real women who have lived through some very challenging times. And you don't need to fictionalize it. The stories themselves are fascinating. So yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it, that it took me this long to kind of learn the lesson, but maybe it took this long for me to be actually able to write this book. I think there's something about being older as well, that you can appreciate history, you can see the perspective, you can see patterns, and you can acknowledge what it might have been like as a 20-year-old or a 40-year-old or a child, because you yourself have gone through those ages, and you can try to empathize and put yourself in that spot and imagine what it must have been like. And I don't think I could have written the same book if I'd been 30 years old.
So true. Age brings wisdom, doesn't it? And on that note, what are you working on now?
Oh, I've got a few ideas. I'm incubating. I've given myself the year to research and doodle with words to see if any of them, I think there may be one or two of the threads that are slowly rising to the surface now. And we'll just see whether there's actually anything there. I love the research part. I think maybe part of the reason why it's taken this long is I was trying desperately to write a fictional book because I love reading fiction. And I kind of think maybe my métier is nonfiction, certainly for the moment. So I think it will be another nonfiction historic element, but I haven't defined what it is yet, and I'm just loving the exploration process.
Do you have any advice for individuals that would like to unearth their family roots?
Well, I think obviously going to sites that take your genealogy, joining a genealogical society, going on to ancestry.ca or whatever. A lot of these genealogical societies actually include access to these sites. And so you can also go to local archives and libraries, especially if your family is from a place, to, when we can, go to those places physically and go to the local museums and libraries and archives and look through the old newspapers. And you can gain a lot of information, contextual, but sometimes very specific to your own family's time that they were there. But the one thing I would say, and we've talked on this before, is record yourself. Record your mother, record your aunt, record your brother, record your grandfather. Get them talking in their own words about what it was like growing up, what their parents were like, what their grandparents were like. Because when they're gone, that information is gone. That first-hand actual memory of things is gone, right down to what did they eat, what was their favorite Christmas gift, where did they go on holiday. All these things are going to be gone. And don't forget about yourself, your childhood, your memories of the foods you ate, the books you read. You may think that that's not important because it's recent history, but at some point it won't be. And I know how I felt when I listened to these cassettes of my grandmother speaking or my grandfather being interviewed, and listening to that and hearing their voices come back to me from the past, telling me about their lives, was just the most extraordinary gift. And somebody's going to feel that way about you, whether it's in 10 years or 50 years or 100 years. They will hear your voice. And even if they don't remember you, your voice itself, your authenticity will come through and your memories will be really relevant. So definitely record yourself and record people and just have that on hand to dip into. And then consider it as a love letter to your daughter or your granddaughter or your great-granddaughter or your niece or some child that you babysat. Like, the gifts that we get from our ancestors, we have it in us to pass those gifts on, and the gift of memory and the gift of knowledge and experience that no one else has, your life memory, your life experience, but you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for being on A Writer's Life. Truly enjoyed listening to your journey of discovering and unearthing your family history and sharing it. I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Hagen. It's been lovely to talk to you about your family as well, and to share our own feelings about our writing and about our families and how they can intertwine.
That was Jennifer Butler reading from her book, Boom and Bust, The Resilient Women of Historic Telegraph Cove, published by Touchwood Edition. For more information about her and where to purchase her book, please check the links below. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to A Writer's Life? And if you want more information about myself and my novel Secrets in the Shadows, visit my website at www.heigebohm.ca. For a kinder world, take care of each other.